Interest in Julia Perry and her music has been on the rise recently, and I am delighted because there is so very much work to be done. We need a village of Perry scholars all sharing information and ideas together. My paper today is a very preliminary examination of Perry's work, The Selfish Giant. This piece has never been performed. There are no recordings. There are no parts. There is no published score, just the piano vocal manuscript in Perry's handwriting. But even so, it's a work that was very clearly important to Perry. It's complete. It's full of details about casting and costuming. It's got stage directions. It's absurdist and odd and about love, selfless, generous love, and also about women's educational rights and roles in society, the Cold War and the military industrial complex, and religion. Maybe one day the people who come to make up the Perry Village will be able to engrave it and perform it. Helen Walker Hill's biography of Perry in From Spirituals to Symphonies is still the most complete study of Perry's life we have to date. Here I will offer a very brief overview. Perry was born in 1924 and grew up in Akron, Ohio. She studied voice, piano, and violin throughout high school, adding composition and conducting in college. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees from Westminster Choir College in 1947 and 48. Talented, hardworking, and ambitious, Perry sought out opportunities to make herself known as a composer, conductor, and vocalist. She studied and performed widely in the United States and Europe. During the 1950s, she was in high demand and often in the news, performing and conducting her own pieces. She received commissions and had her work recorded. She had residencies at the MacDowell Colony, and she won Guggenheim Fellowships. In 1956 and 1957, she also worked in Western Europe as a cultural liaison of the U.S. Information Service, which used American artists and other prominent figures to counter negative propaganda spread by the USSR about the U.S. through a series of concerts and lectures. The USIS sponsored Perry and arranged for her to participate in high-profile events, including conducting the BBC Orchestra and the Vienna Philharmonic in performances of her own work. But as Walker Hill has written, Perry's outlook, interests, and even personality changed dramatically during the 1950s. In 1953, she declared that she was no longer a singer. And in 1959, a friend described the once extroverted Perry as having become, quote, peculiar, difficult, and quick to take offense, end quote. Perry made demands of composers' recordings that alienated her from the company, cut off many of her friends, and stopped performing altogether. Walker Hill suggested these changes may have stemmed from the onset and development of acromegaly, a condition that causes enlarged hands, feet, and face, fatigue and joint weakness, limited mobility, a deepened voice, and other physical changes. We've all witnessed the cruelty of the classical music world when it comes to appearance, and so I sympathize with Perry and her apparent desire to control who had access to her. In the 1960s, Perry struggled to find long-term work and tried enrolling in graduate programs as a means of keeping afloat, although she did not complete any additional degrees. She moved back and forth between Akron and New York for a time. In both places, she taught private music lessons, was a substitute teacher, and did translation work. She continued to compose prolifically and submitted scores to conductors and publishers, but this was generally to little avail. The last piece published commercially during her lifetime was Homunculus CF, which came out in 1960. In 1964, she was the winner of the National Institute of Arts and Letters Award, but this too does not seem to have helped her career. For the 1967 to 68 academic year, she was composer in residence at Florida A&M University, but her relationship with the university was fraught. In 1970, she suffered the first of 3 strokes. This stroke left her unable to walk or to use the right side of her body. She taught herself to write with her left hand, but did not regain the ability to walk. She spoke with difficulty and, over the next several years, frequently seemed to be confused, submitting the same scores to the same publishers repeatedly, losing scores in other documents, and slowly becoming unable to care for herself. Her scores, never the most legible, became even more difficult to parse, and even the publishers with whom she had worked before regularly rejected her submissions. Colleagues urged her to donate her papers to Fisk University or to other places capable of preserving them, but she did not, and after her death in 1979, most of her pieces, in fact more than half of them, were lost. Here are some of these lost works. We also have few letters or other documents written by Perry, which leaves significant lacunas in our understanding of her life and work. Walker Hill cites Perry's sister Lucy Perry Bigby as her sole heir, but researchers, including me, have been unable to locate her or any other relatives or potential heirs. Today, the Julia Perry Working Group on Humanities Commons seeks to collect scores, research, and other documents relating to Perry and make them freely available for performance and scholarship. And I'll share this URL again at the end. Many of Perry's early works are classicized spirituals and gospel songs that, while tonal, use the short motifs and pedal points or drones and/or repeated pitches in the accompaniment that we'll see in her later works. By 1951, the date of her Stabat Mater, which is perhaps her most performed piece, she had adopted traditional serial techniques. As Meg Wilhoit has noted, the Stabat Mater uses symmetrical serial rows that are frequently repeated in their prime forms, transposed by just 1 to 3 semitones, or hinge on central pitches around which other pitches in the row move, such as in the first movement of the work. Wilhoit's analysis also demonstrates that Perry uses texture to communicate the formal design of individual movements and sections. Perry's later works, including The Selfish Giant, do this as well. Finally, this analysis of the Stabat Mater shows Perry's use of drones beneath limited pitch class sets, which also foreshadows her extensive use of drones and serial minimalism in her later works, including The Selfish Giant. While we often associate minimalism with white male composers based on the East Coast of the United States, it's worth noting that Perry was 10 years older than the composers who are currently associated with the origins of minimalism. Steve Reich, Terry Riley, and Lamont Young were all born in 1935. Philip Glass was born in 1937. The Selfish Giant was composed in the same year as Terry Riley's In C, and 11 years before Glass's Einstein on the Beach, which all of those male-written textbooks keep telling us is the first minimalist opera. It's unclear how much of Perry's work from the 1950s these composers knew, but by the mid-50s her compositional approach was well established, and her works were present in concert halls and on LPs. So it's not outrageous to think that at least one of these vanguards of minimalism was heard and influenced by her work. Perry's 1953 opera, The Cask of Amontillado, shows a development of Perry's approach towards vocal writing on the stage. There is spoken rhythmic text, or Sprechstimme, that is unpitched. There is text that's set on a single pitch, Sprechgesang, and there is text that is set melodically. And while Perry uses much more musical movement and different textures in Cask than she does in, say, The Selfish Giant, it's also easy to see how she's working with the minimalist techniques that, as we'll see, are even more prominent in The Selfish Giant. Her piano concerto, begun in the same year as The Selfish Giant, also employs this approach of similar repeated small pitch class cells that Perry transposes up or down just a few semitones from the prime row, a practice she would retain for the rest of her career. This use of small pitch class sets is minimalistic intent and in use. Perry's works composed after The Cask of Amontillado, which 1953, are significantly more minimalist and for the most part rhythmically or technically simpler than those she composed earlier, with the exception of Homunculus CF, which is rhythmically really complex and a fascinating piece. Perhaps Perry preferred serial or minimalist approaches from an aesthetic point of view, but it's also possible that she felt that simpler works would be easier to get performed, or perhaps she was writing for musicians who needed scores that were less technically difficult. It's hard to say. Her Symphony No. 4 is a single movement work that was also composed in 1964, and it is technically suitable for a non-professional orchestra. Perry's adaptation of Oscar Wilde's Catholic fairy tale, The Selfish Giant, is a work about inclusion and the breaking down of hegemonic barriers. Perry's experiences with gender discrimination inform The Selfish Giant, which speaks to issues of equality in education and opportunities for women, as well as demonstrating how men's behaviors contribute to women's discomfort and dis-ease or unease in the workplace. The original and much simpler version of The Selfish Giant penned by Wilde is a story about redemption through the crucifixion and is about finding happiness and being generous enough to help others to be happy. But Perry's version overlays issues of gender and education, the Cold War, the American military-industrial complex, and a climate of unfamiliar morals on top of this story, which complicates it in very contemporary ways. In The Selfish Giant, Perry adapts Wilde's short story for Act 1 and 3. Act 2 is written by Perry herself and introduces new ideas, setting, and characters. There's a handout available online that includes a synopsis of the piece. Here I focus on a scene from Act 1 where 4 schoolgirls exploring a derelict garden long ago abandoned by the Selfish Giant discuss their schooling. domestic and culinary science, training to be a quote-unquote useful woman in a heteronormative, class-aware American, U.S. American society, and how their education compares with that of a woman cosmonaut. Perry scores this section for 4 schoolgirls. As with most of this piece, she calls for Sprechgesang for the schoolgirls more than traditional singing, as you can see here. When there is vocalization, the orchestra usually provides an underlying drone of the pitch class set in use, as seen here, or a portion of the pitch class set. In transitions between scenes, like here, Perry frequently uses faster movement with a sparser texture, often outlining the limited pitch class sets that she's using. In this example from measure 62 to 70, Perry tweaks these sets very delicately, changing just 1 or 2 pitches in each iteration. She also creates very short rows and transposes them by semitone or tone, repeats them several times, and then creates new rows, which are often closely related to previous rows in which she raises or lowers 1 or 2 pitches to create a new pitch class set. Her work here is a really great example of the concept of developing variation, which is something that can also be applied in analyzing her music. Throughout this example, she's playing with seconds and thirds, while first moving through rhythmically faster and more expansive configurations until the arrival of a new drone, in this case the A in the penultimate bar. What's revealing in The Selfish Giant are the places where Perry changes his texture and approach, places where we get more movement and agitation, and where the pitch class sets are perhaps made more obvious through augmentation or diminution of the rhythmic material. I think Perry wants audiences to feel uncomfortable or jerked out of the complacency that the more musically static or dreamy passages evoke. And the first instance of this happens when the 4th schoolgirl challenges the 1st schoolgirl about what kind of education the 1st schoolgirl thinks a Soviet cosmonaut gets. The 4th schoolgirl clearly thinks it's better and consists of more information than the highly gendered and infantilizing domestic education that she and her classmates are receiving. For the first time since the girls entered the scene, one of them, the 4th schoolgirl, has a line that breaks away from Sprechgesang, moving in leaps to octaves. And the orchestral music also moves away from the drones that had previously accompanied the girls' discussion. As soon as the 4th schoolgirl begins her question, how do you account for that cosmonet, the duration of pitches in the orchestral music shortens into heretofore unseen sixteenths, moving through repeated pitch combinations that center around an 026 figure in both the upper and lower voices, and that's what's marked out here. This minimalistic motif is constant and at times reduced to a repeated dyad, which is another technique that foreshadows Young and Glass. When the schoolgirls interrupt the 4th schoolgirl, here, the vocal technique returns to Sprechgesang without much change of pitch and orchestral drones. Finally, Perry drops the activity level of the 4th schoolgirl's vocal line down to the level of the other schoolgirl, as the 4th schoolgirl, clearly irritated at having to spell things out, uses Sprechgesang, calls them stupid, and reiterates her statement that women cosmonauts don't learn to just crochet. The relative complexity of the 4th schoolgirl's vocal line, and perhaps more importantly, the orchestral music that goes with it, suggests a sophistication and individuality, being aware of cosmonauts, for example, that run counter to the other schoolgirls' heavily gendered heterosexual outlooks for material goods and marriage. In Perry's citation of a cosmonaut rather than an astronaut, I think there's also a hint here of Cold War anxieties, that the Soviet Union is more invested in and or further advanced in treating women equally than in the US. While Perry was composing this work, Valentina Tereshkova had just made history as the first woman in space. It's unclear just how strongly Perry identified at this time with American propaganda, but I read the schoolgirls who monotonously sing of marriage and housekeeping and appropriate appearances as potentially standing in as American foils for the supposedly progressive Soviets. These schoolgirl Americans, being conservative and unenlightened and unable to think of a life outside of marriage and wifehood, are alternately dull and annoying, while the 4th schoolgirl has a cosmopolitan, forward-looking stance. Following the 4th schoolgirl's outburst and attempt to speak to the other girls in their own vocal medium, the schoolgirls all sing about the conflicting and abstract messages they receive from their teachers in a text that touches on the absurd. It shades of Godot and the Garden. The fourth schoolgirl later returns with her same question about the cosmonaut, along with the first schoolgirl, who has been persuaded by the fourth schoolgirl's way of thinking. These two continue to ask the others to think beyond their personal experiences, beyond sexism, beyond the implicit capitalist model in which women serve men so that the men can make money, which is explored a lot in Act Two. But the second and third schoolgirls reply in their monotone, "We believe that perfecting the science of domesticity is women's obligation to man." All four of the schoolgirls claim to be their mother's children, but there is considerable tension in this claim, a conflict that reflects contemporary society. The second and third schoolgirls hold that culinary science will lead us to bridal trousseaux. This is our mature position in mankind, while 1 and 4 retort, if that is your idea of education, then we want OUT out. Here the texture is that of Sprechgesang and drones, and interpolated with the schoolgirls' passages are those with the returned schoolboys who plan to rule the garden as their own little kingdom. Perry uses semitone and whole tone movement to create tension in the passage, varying her original pitch class set subtly with each progressing measure, just as we saw before. Again, she rarely seems to transpose her rosetsets, but instead modifies them with stepwise motion that is kind of reminiscent of, but not, of course, actually adhering to diatonic practices. The climax of this passage occurs in measure 179, where Perry moves from a series of sets building on 0134 to 01245 679. In the following schoolboys 1 and 4 enter, treating the garden as their own private territory and complicating the flow of ideas being exchanged, presented, in layers. So in this reduction, schoolgirls 1 and 4 are in the top line. Schoolgirls 2 and 3 are represented by the second line. At the very end of it, where it says SB 1 and 4, those are schoolboys 1 and 4 entering and trying to take over the conversation and take over the garden. And the bottom two lines are a reduction of the piano as well. Perry is clearly working here with serialism, minimalism, and textures in ways that create a complex world for this piece. Perhaps a world bounded by small intervals and minor transpositions, but one that assigns types of behavior to the characters who stand in for factions in the real world. The schoolboys get away with skipping school, trespassing in the garden, and claiming it as their own. The schoolgirls, who enter the garden after school and look around it demurely, are taught to be quiet, sit still, iron their petticoats. The tapestry of their existence is disrupted by the fourth schoolgirl's agitation and outburst. But there's so much more to ask. Why do the schoolgirls have this conversation anyway? Is it to establish Perry's views on gender equality? Is she, the fourth schoolgirl, dropping "huh" in her speech as a way of signifying anger, something Walker Hill has suggested about her use of vernacular language? How does this material intersect with race? How does or how would this scene change if we imagine an all-white cast or an all-black cast? As a Black woman who had worked for the U.S. government, perhaps Perry felt torn over Tereshkova's flight. The U.S. would not send a Black astronaut into space until after Perry died. It was Guy Bluford in 1983. Nor would an American woman fly until that same year. Of course, that was Sally Ride. As a single woman, perhaps queer, did Perry chafe at the concept of heterosexual marriage as obligatory? It certainly doesn't come across, as something anyone would want here. And of course, this tiny case study hardly scratches the opera. I started to do work on Act Two, and there was so much of it, I realized that was like a whole nother hour of talking. There are two more acts, even more waiting for Godot, like, passages and scenes with complex serial forms and networks. There's an obvious critique of capitalism and a long section featuring the elements of winter, including frost and snow, that may have come from the worry of nuclear winter, perhaps? Basing it on Wild, but beefing it up a little bit. Is it a meditation on the USSR, similar to that made by C.S. Lewis, where in Narnia it is always winter and never Christmas, because officially there are no Christians? An autobiographical scene about Perry's loneliness and despair over her career? There's still so much we don't know about Perry yet, about her politics and beliefs and who she loved and what her struggles were. So even by reading this opera closely and knowing how it's built, I can still only speculate on some of its meaning. What I know for certain, though, is that we need to begin building the Perry village, right? There's so much work. And I want to, really impress upon everyone that there's room for everyone in doing this work, right? I've cleared a plot and I've planted the seeds. So please come to the Perry Village, Bring or send your students and colleagues and friends. There's some really exciting research to be done in every area of her life and works. This is just a quick list of some of the resources. This is the Julia Perry Research Group URL. You can just take a shot of this with your phone if you want, or you can email me to get this information. The material in the Julia Perry Working Group is an amalgamation of scholarly materials as well as most of the scores in PDF form that are part of the Helen Walker Hill collection of Julia Perry materials at the Center for Black Music Research in Chicago. Fisk has a small collection as well, and so does Westminster Choir College. And I've also just begun a Zotero group. For those of you who use Zotero, which is a citation management tool, there's a Zotero group for works related to Perry as well. Thank you very much.